When you both stop contacting each other, the game flips, psychology tricks. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where two people stop talking? No more texts, no more calls, just silence? You might think the relationship is over. But in reality, silence is when the game starts to change. Silence is the moment when all the emotions, power dynamics, and habits in a relationship start to flip. Imagine facing a psychological battle with no words, where neither person says anything, but both can feel something has shifted. That's when silence speaks up, and the game between the two of you begins to transform. It's when the real game starts, and you can't even see it coming. Understanding the avoidant attachment style. When we talk about people with an avoidant attachment style, it's not that they don't care or love. They might love, but they're afraid of love. They're scared of closeness, of getting hurt, and losing control. They crave independence and feel safest in their own space. But often, they don't know how to express this in a healthy way. So, why do they act this way? Maybe they've experienced past trauma from family, old relationships, or painful experiences that make them never want to face those intense feelings again. They've learned to pull away when things get too close or they fear being hurt. They see intimacy as a gap they can't control, so they build emotional walls to avoid anything that might force them to open up. But does anyone truly understand this? In today's society, we often judge others based on their actions and expressions. But for the avoidant, they don't openly show their emotions. When they stop contacting you and go silent, others might think they don't care or that they don't love you. But in reality, they're internalizing their feelings, avoiding the pain they fear would come from getting too close. Silence, for them, is how they protect their sense of self. We've all heard that silence is golden, but in this case, silence is a shield, a way to avoid confronting feelings they're not ready to deal with. However, this silence has a huge consequence. Over time, they realize that their protection actually leaves them lonely, forcing them to face the fear of losing connection, of being abandoned. Not only does this threaten their sense of safety, but it also drags them into a psychological battle they can't win. And here's the real question: is silence really an effective strategy to protect oneself? Or is it the reason they end up more isolated, losing out on relationships that really matter? The other side, chasing or losing. When someone with an avoidant attachment style stops reaching out, the other person, someone with a secure or anxious attachment style, starts feeling like the world is falling apart. They can't understand why the other person pulled away so suddenly, and they can't stop wondering why there's silence. The only question running through their mind is, how do I get them back? You've probably been in this situation yourself. You know you can't force the other person to do anything, but the uncertainty starts to make you feel like you're losing your mind. And as silence lingers, anxiety and desperation start to take over. Here's the thing: when you feel abandoned, you tend to chase. Everything turns into a race. You text more, call more, hoping for a response. But here's the hard truth: this relationship is not a race, and trying to chase after them only makes you lose control and hurt yourself more. Every message, every phone call is a reaction. It's driven by fear, by a lack of confidence in the relationship. But is it really fear of loss, or is it just a habit? Are you chasing because you can't face the truth? This is an important question to ask yourself. In many relationships, people chase because they can't stand the idea of being alone. But in doing so, they end up relying on the other person's feedback to feel valued. Think about it. Have you ever asked yourself, do I love myself enough not to need validation from someone else? Silence and psychological transformation. Silence is often mistaken as the end of something, the death of communication, the fading of connection, the final goodbye. But what if silence isn't an end at all? What if it's the most profound moment of psychological transformation? The period of silence, though seemingly still and empty, is actually a powerful time of deep self-reflection and internal shift. It's not just about what's not being said, it's about what's finally being realized. In the context of relationships, silence can feel excruciating. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, silence is often their only shield, a way to protect themselves from the emotional vulnerability they fear so deeply. They might believe that by withdrawing, by creating distance, they can shield themselves from pain. They retreat into silence not out of indifference, but out of a deep, underlying terror of being hurt. The silence is not about ignoring the other person, but about avoiding the raw, unfiltered truth of their own emotions. But here's the question: what happens when silence is no longer a shield, but a mirror? As the silence drags on, something subtle begins to happen. The very thing that was meant to protect starts to unravel. What was once a wall becomes a prison. The avoidant begins to confront the very thing they've been trying to avoid: their own fear of abandonment, their own emotional vulnerability, and their deep-seated belief that closeness equals inevitable pain. The silence forces them to face the truth. They can't hide forever. The emotional walls they built for protection are actually keeping them trapped in isolation. This period of silence isn't empty. It's pregnant with the possibility of growth. It's an invitation to shift, to evolve. The question now is, are they ready to let go of their fears and embrace intimacy, or will they continue to retreat into the safe distance of silence, sacrificing connection for the illusion of control? For the person on the other side of the silence, the one left wondering, waiting, and often chasing, silence can feel like an emotional abyss. It's a vacuum that swallows up certainty, leaving only anxiety and doubt in its wake. They can't help but wonder, why is this happening? Is it me? Did I do something wrong? The silence, while deafening, offers no answers, only questions. And in their attempts to fill the void, they begin to lose themselves in their own insecurities. They chase, they beg for validation, they reach out over and over, hoping that somehow, some way, the silence will break. But here's the critical question: what if the silence isn't meant to be filled by words or actions, but by something deeper, by self-awareness, by self-love, by self-understanding? As the silence stretches on, the person left behind might start to realize that their desperate attempts to bridge the gap are not only futile, but they may also be a reflection of a deeper issue, an issue of self-worth. They might begin to question, why am I so afraid of being alone? Why do I need the other person's response to feel valued? The real transformation begins when they stop seeking validation from the other person and start looking inward. Can you find peace without external validation? Can you learn to stand firm in your own worth without needing someone else to tell you you're enough? This is where the silence becomes transformative. Instead of running after the person who's withdrawn, they begin to run towards themselves. They face the uncomfortable truth that they have been relying too heavily on the external to define their internal sense of self. And as they begin to build a stronger sense of self-worth, they realize that they no longer need the other person's constant feedback to feel whole. They begin to understand that silence, in its truest form, is not a void to be feared, but a space to find themselves again. For both people, the silence forces an awakening. The avoidant person starts to realize that their need for control has only kept them from experiencing the true depth of connection. They begin to confront the fact that intimacy doesn't have to mean vulnerability that leads to pain. It can also lead to growth, joy, and emotional fulfillment. The person on the other side starts to see that they don't need to chase approval to feel secure. They realize that their own happiness, their own worth, doesn't come from anyone else but themselves. But here's the paradox: as they both change, will the relationship ever be the same again? Can the transformation that silence forces upon them lead to a stronger, more authentic connection, or will it mark the end of a relationship that can no longer be healed? The truth is, silence may never have been about the other person at all. It's about you. It's about finding yourself in the stillness. It's about seeing where you've been hiding, where you've been avoiding your own feelings, and asking yourself, how much longer can I live in this space of fear and avoidance? So the question becomes, what do you do with the silence? Will it paralyze you, leaving you stuck in the past? Or will it propel you forward into a deeper understanding of who you are, what you need, and how you can build stronger relationships, not just with others, but with yourself? Silence is not the absence of sound, it's the presence of truth. What will that truth reveal to you? Psychological attraction and change from both sides. Silence is not just a void, it's a powerful psychological force. It's a subtle but profound shift that many don't realize until it's too late. Silence exposes everything, the feelings, the habits, and the walls both people built to protect themselves. And within this silence, something interesting starts to happen. The power dynamics shift without a single word being spoken. In fact, when one person stops chasing, the other starts feeling a noticeable absence. When silence goes on, the sense of safety and control that the avoidant once had starts to crumble. They thought pulling away was a victory, but now silence is reflecting all the weaknesses they tried to hide. Suddenly, silence isn't a shield anymore. It's a mirror showing their deepest fears: fear of being abandoned, fear of getting hurt, and fear of confronting their emotional vulnerabilities. So here's the real question: do they have enough courage to face what they've been avoiding? As silence drags on, they can no longer control everything like before. They can't keep pulling away. What they don't realize is that silence is forcing them to confront their true selves. They're no longer feeling strong or in control. They feel empty, insecure, and lacking. And in this moment, silence becomes the only teacher who helps them see that the distance they created wasn't protection, but self-imprisonment. On the other hand, for the other person, silence is an opportunity to look within. It's a test. Without anything to hold on to, no texts, no calls, they face an empty relationship they never thought would happen. They begin to feel lost and confused, realizing that maybe this emptiness was always there, just hidden until now. What's fascinating is that once they stop feeling like everything is within their control, they start to question their dependency on this relationship. Have they been too reliant on feedback from the other person to feel good about themselves? Suddenly, they realize that chasing, whether they're aware of it or not, is an endless loop. When they don't get a response, that uncertainty becomes a deep awareness of the habits they've nurtured. And from this awareness, change begins from within, not because of the other person, but because they finally recognize it and make adjustments. So, you might wonder, is this change a result of growth or just exhaustion from having no other choice? Can silence really be an opportunity for the other person to find themselves, rather than just a prolonged feeling of emptiness and desperation? Strategies and psychology after silence. When the silence drags on and both sides begin to shift their perspective on the relationship, a crucial question arises. Can we really come back from this, or has silence created an irreparable crack? People often say that time heals all wounds, but the question is time an enemy of silence, or is it really an opportunity for change? Silence isn't just a pause in communication. It's like a psychological experiment. Habits and emotions that have been buried for so long now start to surface. What happens when we no longer seek validation from the other person? Over time, a painful truth starts to surface. Maybe you don't actually need the other person to be happy. This is one of the most profound psychological shifts. During the silence, you begin to realize that their validation isn't the only thing that makes you feel worthy. You stop chasing or trying to fix the relationship by reaching out constantly. You start to understand that growth comes from finding value in yourself, not from constantly chasing approval from others. But is this the end of the relationship, or just a transitional phase? That's not an easy question to answer. Silence can make you feel worse in the beginning, but as time goes on and things settle, this lack of communication opens up a huge opportunity. It's a chance to redefine who you are in the relationship, not based on what the other person gives you, but on what you can bring to yourself. Silence is really a battle between two emotional forces. One side wants connection, to be loved, while the other fears closeness and avoids deep emotions. The real question is, who will change after the silence? Will you break free from old emotional patterns, or will you continue to live in a relationship without knowing what you truly want? This is where true growth begins. You learn that a relationship is about mutual respect and sharing, but more importantly, it's about understanding and respecting yourself. You stop waiting for perfection from the other person. You stop being pulled into the chase or avoidance game. You start to rebuild your inner strength. Silence, though it may seem like an enemy, is the teacher who shows you that only when you can stand strong on your own will you be able to build a solid relationship with someone else. So, how will silence change you? Will you let it break the relationship, or will you turn it into an opportunity to grow stronger than before? Let time answer that, but this time, not just with the other person, but with yourself. The power of letting go, surrendering control in silence. In relationships, one of the hardest things to accept is that we cannot control everything. We can't control another person's feelings, thoughts, or actions. Yet, in the heat of the moment, when silence stretches between you and the person you care about, the instinct to regain control intensifies. The more you try to take charge of the situation, to initiate conversations, to resolve the silence, the further you may push the other person away. What is it about silence that makes us feel so powerless? Why do we feel the need to fill it, to speak, to act, to make it go away? For those with an avoidant attachment style, silence is a defense mechanism, a way to establish control over their own emotions and environment. They fear emotional vulnerability, and so, when things become too real, they retreat into the safety of silence. But here's the paradox. In trying to control the silence, we often lose control of the very thing we want to protect, the relationship itself. Instead of forcing a conversation or sending a message to break the silence, what if we surrendered? What if we allowed the silence to be? What if we let it transform us rather than feeling we need to control it? Letting go of control doesn't mean giving up on the relationship. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about giving space for growth, both individually and together. Letting go means trusting that time will reveal the path forward, and that through this period of silence, each person will confront their own fears, insecurities, and desires. Letting go of control is not about abandoning the relationship, but about trusting that silence can lead to a deeper understanding of yourself and your partner. During this period of withdrawal, you begin to see that the true fear isn't the silence itself, but what the silence reveals about your own emotional dependencies. Why do you feel so compelled to fix everything? Why do you believe that constant communication is a necessity for love? Often, the answer lies within a deep-seated fear of abandonment or a need for validation from someone else. When you stop chasing, when you stop trying to control, something amazing happens. You begin to understand that your worth isn't tied to another person's approval. The more you release the need to control the situation, the more you create room for self-reflection and personal growth. In this space, you start to realize that silence is not an enemy, but a companion guiding you towards deeper emotional independence. The avoidant person, too, must learn to let go of their fear of intimacy. The walls they've built to protect themselves from emotional pain are not helping them grow. They are keeping them trapped in isolation. True growth happens when we face our fears head-on, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable in the safe space of silence. Silence doesn't have to be a prison. It can be a sanctuary where emotional transformation occurs. In this quiet surrender, both individuals are faced with a choice. Will they continue the chase and retreat, or will they allow themselves to grow and reconnect in a more authentic way? Silence, in this sense, becomes a reset button. It's a powerful invitation to move beyond old patterns of behavior and enter a new phase of emotional maturity and connection. The role of self-discovery in the silence. As silence extends, something powerful begins to unfold: self-discovery. In a world that constantly demands our attention and validation from others, silence forces us to confront who we are when no one is around. In the absence of communication, we are left with ourselves, our thoughts, and our emotions. It is in this space that the deepest self-reflection occurs. When you find yourself in the silence of a relationship, especially one where there is uncertainty, the initial response is often panic or anxiety. You might find yourself questioning everything. Did I do something wrong? What went wrong? Why am I being ignored? But what if, instead of focusing on the absence of communication, you turned inward and explored your own emotional landscape? In moments of silence, your true feelings and needs surface, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. You might realize that you've been holding onto old emotional baggage, trying to seek love and validation in places where it can never truly be found. The silence becomes a mirror, reflecting your deepest desires, fears, and insecurities. And in this reflection, there lies an opportunity for immense personal growth. The key is to not get lost in the emptiness. Silence, in its purest form, is an opportunity to reconnect with yourself. When you no longer have the other person's responses to dictate your mood, you start to realize that you have the power to shape your own happiness. You are no longer relying on the constant validation or reassurance from others to feel good about yourself. This is where the magic of self-discovery happens, when you can look into the silence and find peace within your own heart. In a relationship where one person has withdrawn, the person left behind often enters a period of introspection. It is here, in the quiet moments, that you can start to ask yourself the tough questions. Do you feel worthy of love without needing someone else to affirm that worth? Have you been seeking approval to feel validated, and is that healthy for you? Do you feel complete without the presence of someone else, or are you relying on them to fill an emotional void within you? As you delve into these questions, you begin to peel away the layers of insecurity and doubt. You learn that love is not about possession or control. It's about mutual respect and understanding. It's about giving space to the other person without losing sight of who you are. The more you allow yourself to discover the truth about your own emotions, the more you understand that silence is not the end. It's the beginning of a journey toward emotional independence and growth. The silence becomes less about the other person's actions and more about your own transformation. It's no longer about seeking answers from the external world. It's about finding the answers within yourself. In this space of self-discovery, you reclaim your sense of self-worth and understand that you are complete on your own. You realize that you are not defined by the relationship, but by the strength and resilience you cultivate within yourself. From silence to reconnection, can you bridge the gap? So, after all the silence, the question remains, can you reconnect? Can the distance that was created during this period of emotional withdrawal ever be bridged? The answer lies not in the words exchanged, but in the transformation that happens within each person during the silence. Silence is a test. It reveals not just the cracks in a relationship, but also the weaknesses within ourselves. It's a moment where each person has the opportunity to confront their fears: fear of abandonment, fear of vulnerability, fear of not being enough. These fears often become the very barriers that prevent us from reconnecting after a period of silence. However, silence can also be a catalyst for deep emotional healing and transformation. Both individuals, the avoidant and the one left behind, can emerge from this period of withdrawal with a new understanding of themselves and each other. For the avoidant person, the silence forces them to confront their fears of intimacy and emotional pain. They begin to see that their need for control and distance has not protected them. It has only isolated them further from meaningful connection. For the person left behind, the silence is a chance to learn the importance of self-worth, emotional independence, and the ability to stand strong without seeking constant validation from the other person. The key to reconnection lies in both individuals being open to change. The avoidant person must be willing to face their fear of emotional closeness and vulnerability. The other person must let go of the need for constant reassurance and validation and instead focus on their own growth. When both individuals come to this realization, they can begin to bridge the gap created by silence. But bridging the gap is not about going back to the way things were. It's about moving forward with a deeper understanding of each other's needs, boundaries, and emotional worlds. It's about finding a new way to relate to each other, one that's based on mutual respect, emotional honesty, and a willingness to grow together. The silence, in this sense, has served its purpose. It has forced both individuals to face their inner demons, to confront their vulnerabilities, and to realize that true connection is not about avoiding pain, but embracing it with open hearts. As they begin to rebuild their relationship, they do so from a place of greater emotional maturity and self-awareness. Can silence lead to reconnection? Yes, if both people are willing to embrace change and growth. It may not be easy, and it may take time, But the silence offers a profound opportunity to rebuild the relationship on a stronger, more authentic foundation. The real question is, are you ready to bridge the gap, to move beyond the silence and create something more meaningful than before? The ultimate transformation, rebirth through silence. In the depths of silence, where words fail and emotions are left unspoken, something incredible can happen: transformation. While most people perceive silence as a void, an absence, or even a sign of an ending, it is, in fact, a fertile ground for personal and relational rebirth. This period of quiet is not the conclusion of a relationship, but its potential renaissance, an opportunity for both individuals to shed old patterns, redefine their identities, and emerge stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. To fully grasp the power of transformation through silence, we must first examine what silence actually does. At its core, silence forces us to confront ourselves. It strips away the distractions, the constant noise of communication, the reliance on external validation, and leaves us face to face with the rawness of our thoughts and feelings. In a world where so much of our identity is shaped by others, by feedback, by interactions, by approval, silence can feel like a wake-up call to return to ourselves. But transformation doesn't come easily. The initial response to silence can be panic, confusion, or frustration. We are conditioned to believe that a lack of communication means something is wrong, that silence is inherently negative. It challenges our expectations of how relationships should unfold, pushing us into discomfort. And yet, it's in this discomfort where the most profound growth occurs. Like the caterpillar retreating into its cocoon, the silence offers the potential for something new to emerge: the path of self-discovery. For many individuals, the experience of silence in a relationship is deeply unsettling. When someone you care about withdraws, it forces you to question your worth, your value, and your place in their life. This is especially true for individuals who rely heavily on external validation, those who derive their sense of self from the approval or attention of others. In these moments, silence becomes a mirror, reflecting all the insecurities, fears, and emotional dependencies you might have been unaware of before. At first, you might be tempted to fill this void, to send a message, to make a call, to break the silence in an effort to reclaim control. But what happens when you resist that impulse? What happens when you sit with the silence, let it wash over you, and allow yourself to feel the discomfort without rushing to fix it? This is where the real transformation begins. In the stillness, you begin to face the parts of yourself that you've been avoiding. The silence brings up the truth about your own emotional needs, your attachments, and your patterns of behavior. Perhaps you've been chasing approval because you fear being abandoned. Maybe you've been overly dependent on the relationship for your sense of self-worth. The silence, as excruciating as it may feel, gives you the space to recognize these patterns and, ultimately, break free from them. Transformation, after all, is not about changing who you are. It's about shedding the parts of yourself that no longer serve you. It's about reclaiming your inner strength, understanding that your value does not depend on another person's presence or approval. As you sit with the silence and reflect on your emotional landscape, you begin to see that your happiness is not dictated by anyone else. You begin to learn that you are enough, all on your own. And as you do so, you may also discover new facets of yourself, your passions, your desires, your independence, that were previously overshadowed by the constant need for external reassurance. This period of silence becomes a journey of self-empowerment, a return to your authentic self. It's a chance to redefine who you are, what you want, and what you need in relationships. And this is the essence of transformation, not changing because something is wrong, but growing because you are ready to evolve. The healing of old wounds. For the avoidant person, the one who initially withdrew into silence, this process of transformation is equally profound. For them, silence often stems from a deep-seated fear of vulnerability, of getting hurt, or of losing control. Avoidance is a defense mechanism built over time, a way to protect themselves from the rawness of emotional intimacy. But what happens when that defense mechanism is no longer enough? What happens when silence, instead of being a shield, forces them to confront their deepest fears? Silence, for the avoidant, is a double-edged sword. Initially, it offers them the sense of control they crave, a way to keep their emotions in check and maintain distance. But over time, this very distance becomes unbearable. The more they avoid their emotions, the more the fear of abandonment and emotional pain intensifies. Silence, then, becomes the space in which their fears grow louder, forcing them to reckon with the emotional walls they've constructed. In this moment, they must choose. Will they continue retreating, allowing their fear to dictate their behavior, or will they embrace the discomfort of vulnerability and allow themselves to experience the depth of connection they've been avoiding? This is where healing begins. For the avoidant person, true transformation happens when they let go of their need for control. They must learn to embrace their vulnerability, to open themselves up to the possibility of connection, even at the risk of pain. It's about understanding that vulnerability is not weakness, but strength, the strength to face their fears and the courage to seek deeper emotional intimacy. This journey of healing is not linear, nor is it easy. It takes time and patience. The avoidant person may need to work through past trauma, whether from childhood experiences or previous relationships, that has shaped their belief system around intimacy. But silence offers the space for this work to unfold. In the absence of distractions, they can begin to understand the root of their fears, unearth old wounds, and start the healing process. In doing so, they discover a profound truth: connection doesn't have to be a threat. In fact, it can be the very thing that heals them. As they confront their emotional vulnerabilities and let go of their need for control, they open the door to authentic, meaningful relationships, rebuilding the relationship from silence to new beginnings. For both people, the one who withdrew and the one left behind, silence can be a powerful catalyst for transformation. It forces them to grow, to examine their fears, and to confront the emotional patterns that no longer serve them. But as both individuals undergo this transformation, the question arises: can the relationship be rebuilt? Can they reconnect in a way that is deeper and more authentic than before? The answer depends on both people's willingness to change. Rebuilding a relationship after silence requires vulnerability, honesty, and a willingness to face the discomfort of emotional intimacy. It requires letting go of old patterns, the chase, the avoidance, the need for validation, and embracing a new way of relating to one another. If both individuals have done the work to grow, to reflect, heal, and transform, then yes, the relationship can be rebuilt. But it will not be the same as it was before. The silence will have irrevocably changed both people, and in that change lies an opportunity to create something more meaningful. The relationship can evolve into one based on mutual respect, understanding, and emotional maturity. It can become a partnership that is not defined by fear, but by a shared commitment to growth and connection. However, if only one person undergoes this transformation, or if both are unwilling to let go of old patterns, then the relationship may not survive. Silence, in this case, could mark the end of a relationship that was never truly healthy or sustainable. But even in this case, silence can still be seen as a blessing. It marks the end of one chapter, but also the beginning of another. For both individuals, it offers the opportunity to embrace new possibilities, new relationships, new experiences, and new ways of being. The ultimate transformation that silence brings is not just about the relationship, it's about the individuals within it. Silence, in its purest form, offers an invitation to return to yourself, to rediscover your worth, to heal old wounds, and to become the person you are truly meant to be. In the end, silence is not the absence of communication, it is the presence of truth. It reveals our deepest fears and desires, our emotional patterns and dependencies, and offers the space for profound growth. It is in this silence that we find the opportunity for rebirth, a chance to shed old layers, heal, and rise anew. So, what will you do with the silence? Will you let it define you, or will you use it as a springboard for transformation? Will you allow it to break you, or will you let it shape you into a stronger, more self-aware person? The choice is yours. And in the silence, you will find the answers. An ending doesn't always mean it's really over. Silence, though it might seem like the end of everything, is actually the moment of greatest transformation. It's not just about changing the relationship, but about each person realizing their true value. And in that silence, everything starts to change.